wasn't on, and we were able to, when he'd come over, all hours of the night, and we would just sit and talk, and he would tell things about, what he was.
Priscilla Presley has given many interviews since Elvis Presley passed away, but this one was very different. When an interviewer showed her a photo, her reaction shocked everyone as she said it was not Elvis. What photo was she talking about? Was she referring to the man in the coffin? Join us as we uncover the truth behind this mystery. The routine interview that changed everything. Priscilla Presley walked into the familiar surroundings of Graceland on a warm afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the Memphis sun filtered through the tall windows and cast long shadows across the polished floors of the mansion that had been Elvis's sanctuary and eventually his prison. She had agreed to do yet another interview about Elvis, something she had done countless times over the decades since his death, and she assumed this would be no different from all the others where journalists asked the same predictable questions about their romance, their wedding, their life together, and the legacy Elvis had left behind when he passed away in August of 1977. The interviewer was a pleasant middle-aged man named Robert Chen, who specialized in music history and had written extensively about the cultural impact of rock and roll on American society. He seemed well prepared and respectful, with a leather-bound notebook filled with questions and a small digital recorder set up on the antique coffee table between them. And Priscilla appreciated that he appeared to have done his homework rather than showing up with generic questions that could apply to any celebrity interview. She settled into the comfortable chair across from him and smiled warmly, mentally preparing herself to tell the same stories she had shared hundreds of times before about meeting Elvis at that fateful party in Germany when she was just 14 years old and he was already the biggest star in the world. The conversation began exactly as Priscilla expected it would, with Robert asking about those early days when Elvis was serving in the army and how their unlikely romance had blossomed despite the enormous age difference and the disapproval of both their families and the public, who questioned whether Elvis's interest in such a young girl was appropriate. Priscilla shared the familiar anecdotes about Elvis's gentlemanly behavior, how he had been patient and respectful despite what many people assumed about their relationship, and how he had genuinely cared about her education and her well-being, even as his career took him away from Germany and back to the United States, where his fame continued to grow beyond anything anyone could have imagined. She talked about their wedding in Las Vegas, describing the small private ceremony that had been both magical and somewhat rushed, because Elvis wanted to avoid the media circus that would have erupted if news of their wedding had leaked beforehand. She described the birth of Lisa Marie and how Elvis had been an attentive and loving father despite the demands of his career that kept him on the road for months at a time. And she spoke about the challenges of being married to someone who belonged as much to the world as he did to his family. Priscilla had told these stories so many times that she could almost recite them on autopilot, her mind sometimes wandering to other things while her mouth formed the familiar words that journalists always wanted to hear. Robert seemed genuinely interested in her answers and asked thoughtful follow-up questions that showed he understood the complexity of Elvis's personality and the pressures that had ultimately contributed to the breakdown of their marriage and Elvis's declining health in his final years. Priscilla appreciated his sensitivity when discussing the more difficult topics like Elvis's addiction to prescription medications and the isolation that fame had imposed on him, making it impossible for him to live anything resembling a normal life where he could go to a store or a restaurant without being mobbed by fans desperate for a piece of the legend. About 30 minutes into the interview, just as Priscilla was relaxing into the familiar rhythm of the conversation and thinking that this would be another routine addition to the thousands of hours of interview footage about Elvis that existed in archives around the world, Robert's demeanor suddenly changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. He set down his pen and closed his notebook, then reached down beside his chair, where a large manila envelope had been sitting unnoticed throughout their conversation. And the way he handled the envelope suggested that whatever was inside it was both important and potentially explosive. Robert explained that what he was about to show her had nothing to do with the documentary they were supposedly discussing, and that he had actually arranged this interview under somewhat false pretenses because he needed to get her reaction to something that had recently come into his possession. His voice took on a careful, almost apologetic tone, as he told Priscilla that a colleague who specialized in Elvis conspiracy theories had brought this item to his attention just days before. And after seeing it himself, Robert had felt a moral obligation to show it to Priscilla, even though he knew it might be deeply upsetting or disturbing to her. Priscilla felt a small knot of anxiety forming in her stomach as she watched Robert slowly open the envelope and pull out what appeared to be a photograph. And she noticed that his hands were not entirely steady as he held the image for a moment before placing it face up on the coffee table in front of her. The photograph showed the interior of a small-town diner, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a black and white checkered floor that could have been in any rural town across America. And several people were visible in the image, including a waitress carrying a coffee pot, and what appeared to be a family seated in one of the booths near the entrance. But what Priscilla saw in the corner of that photograph would send her world spiraling into chaos and force her to confront questions she had buried for decades. The photograph that stopped her heart. Priscilla leaned forward instinctively to get a better look at the photograph, her eyes scanning the image with casual curiosity that quickly transformed into something approaching shock as Robert pointed to a specific figure sitting alone in a corner booth near the window of the diner. The man was wearing dark sunglasses despite being indoors, and he had positioned himself in a way that suggested he was deliberately trying to avoid being noticed by the other patrons or by anyone who might glance in his direction, with his body angled toward the wall and his head tilted downward as if he was studying the menu with intense concentration. What made Priscilla's breath catch in her throat was not just the man's general appearance, though the resemblance to Elvis was immediately striking, even in the somewhat grainy quality of what appeared to be a snapshot taken by an amateur photographer. It was the specific details that she noticed as she picked up the photograph with trembling hands and brought it closer to her face, examining features that only someone who had lived with Elvis and loved him and studied his face for years would recognize as distinctly and unmistakably his. The man had dark hair that was graying at the temples in a pattern that matched how Elvis's hair had been aging in the final years of his life. And he wore sideburns that were styled in that distinctive way that had become one of Elvis's trademarks, even though that particular style had fallen out of fashion by the early 1980s, when this photograph was allegedly taken. Robert quietly explained that the image had been captured in 1982 by a tourist passing through a small town in Michigan, which would have been 3 years after Elvis's official death in August of 1977, and Priscilla felt her heart begin to race as she tried to process what that timeline might mean if this was really Elvis sitting in that diner. Priscilla's medical training as a nurse, which she had pursued briefly before marrying Elvis, kicked in as she studied the photograph with clinical attention to detail that went beyond simple recognition of facial features. She pointed with a shaking finger to the way the man was holding his coffee cup, noting that Elvis had a very specific and unusual way of gripping cups and glasses, with his pinky finger extended at an odd angle because of an old injury to his hand that he had sustained during his time in the army. The man in the photograph was holding his coffee in exactly that distinctive manner, and Priscilla knew from her years of watching Elvis eat and drink that this was not the kind of detail that someone could fake or copy, because it was an unconscious physical adaptation to chronic pain. She then noticed the man's posture, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward and his spine curved in a particular way, and she explained to Robert in a voice that was barely above a whisper that Elvis had suffered from severe back problems for years after injuring himself during a stage performance in the mid-1960s. The way Elvis sat, stood, and moved had been permanently affected by that injury, creating a distinctive physical signature that was as unique as a fingerprint. And the man in this photograph displayed that exact same posture, down to the specific angle at which he held his head to alleviate pressure on his damaged spine. Priscilla's eyes moved across the photograph, cataloging detail after impossible detail that matched Elvis so precisely that she felt reality beginning to tilt and shift around her, like the world was suddenly operating according to different rules than she had believed governed it. She pointed to a small irregularity in the bone structure of the man's jaw that was visible even in profile, a tiny asymmetry that Elvis had been self-conscious about in his youth, but that Priscilla had come to love because it made his face distinctly his rather than generically handsome like so many other Hollywood stars. The rings on the man's fingers caught her attention next, and Priscilla felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she recognized what appeared to be the exact collection of rings that Elvis had worn almost every day of his life, including a distinctive turquoise ring set in silver that Vernon Presley had given to his son, and that Elvis had treasured as one of his most meaningful possessions. She knew those rings intimately, had felt them against her skin in moments of tenderness and passion, and seeing them on the hand of this stranger who might not be a stranger at all made her feel as if she was losing her grip on what was real and what was possible. But it was the detail in the background of the photograph that truly stopped Priscilla's heart and made her feel as if all the air had been suddenly sucked out of the room. Reflected in the window of the diner, partially visible behind the man who might be Elvis, was the distinctive profile of a vehicle parked outside, and even though the reflection was distorted and unclear, Priscilla could make out enough detail to recognize what appeared to be a Stutz Blackhawk, an extraordinarily rare and expensive automobile that had been produced in very limited numbers and that Elvis had owned and driven with great pride. The odds of a random Elvis impersonator or look-alike sitting in a Michigan diner in 1982 next to one of the rarest cars in America, wearing the exact rings that Elvis had favored, holding a coffee cup in the precise manner that Elvis's injured hand required, and sitting with the distinctive posture that came from Elvis's specific back injury seemed so astronomically small that Priscilla's rational mind could not construct any explanation that made sense. She set the photograph down on the table with hands that were shaking so violently that she nearly dropped it, and she looked up at Robert with an expression that combined terror and confusion and something that might have been hope, or might have been dread, or might have been both emotions tangled together in a way that was impossible to separate. Robert watched Priscilla's reaction with a mixture of concern and scientific curiosity, like a researcher observing the results of an important experiment, and he explained that the photograph had been authenticated by multiple experts who had confirmed it was not digitally manipulated or altered in any way. The image was genuine, he said, taken with a film camera that was common in the early 1980s, and the tourist who had snapped the picture had no connection to Elvis or his family, and no apparent reason to fabricate evidence of Elvis being alive years after his supposed death. What happened next would push Priscilla past the breaking point and force her to confront secrets she had kept even from herself. Priscilla's physical collapse and hidden suspicions. Priscilla stood up from her chair suddenly and without warning, perhaps driven by an instinct to flee from the implications of what she had just seen, or maybe trying to physically distance herself from the photograph that was threatening to upend everything she had believed for decades about Elvis's death and her own grief and the life she had built in the aftermath of losing him. But as soon as she was on her feet, her legs seemed to give way beneath her, as if all the strength had been drained from her muscles, and she swayed dangerously to one side while her face went completely white and her eyes lost their focus. Robert jumped up and rushed to catch her before she could fall, and he managed to guide her back down into the chair while calling out urgently for help from the crew members who were filming the interview from their positions around the room. Priscilla's breathing had become rapid and shallow, coming in quick gasps that suggested she might be hyperventilating or having a panic attack, and her hand was pressed against her chest as if she was experiencing pain or pressure that frightened her. The color had drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin looking almost translucent and clammy to the touch, and beads of perspiration had formed on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature of the air-conditioned room. A production assistant who had some medical training rushed over and began checking Priscilla's vital signs while asking her questions to assess whether she was having a heart attack or stroke or some other medical emergency that would require immediate hospitalization. Priscilla's pulse was racing far too fast, and her blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels that made the assistant recommend calling an ambulance immediately. But Priscilla managed to shake her head and grab the assistant's wrist with surprising strength for someone who appeared to be on the verge of collapse. She insisted in a voice that came out raspy and broken that she was not having a heart attack, that what she was experiencing was emotional shock and overwhelming panic rather than a physical medical crisis, and she begged them not to call emergency services because she did not want this incident to become public knowledge and spawn a media frenzy about Priscilla Presley collapsing during an interview at Graceland. The assistant looked uncertain but agreed to give Priscilla some time to recover while monitoring her closely for any signs that her condition was deteriorating to the point where medical intervention would be necessary, regardless of her wishes. For nearly 15 minutes, Priscilla sat motionless in the chair, with her eyes fixed on the photograph that still lay on the coffee table in front of her. And during that time, she seemed to be having some kind of internal struggle or debate with herself about what she should say, or whether she should say anything at all. Tears streamed down her face, though she made no sound of crying, and occasionally her lips would move as if she was whispering words to herself that no one else could hear. And the crew members who were watching this scene unfold felt deeply uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something intensely private that they had no right to see. Finally, Priscilla wiped her eyes with a tissue that someone handed her, and she took several deep breaths that seemed designed to steady herself and gather the courage for what she was about to do. She looked directly at Robert and asked whether the cameras were still recording everything that was happening. And when he confirmed that they were indeed capturing every moment of this extraordinary interview, Priscilla nodded slowly and said that she needed to tell the truth about things she had kept secret for more than 40 years. Things that she had never shared with anyone because speaking them aloud would make them real in a way that she had not been ready to confront. Her voice was quiet but steady as she began to speak, and she explained that Elvis's death in August of 1977 had never made complete sense to her, even though she had publicly accepted it and genuinely grieved for the loss of the man who had been the center of her world for so many years. She described how, in the months leading up to his death, Elvis had talked increasingly about feeling trapped by his fame and by the expectations that the world had placed on him, about how he sometimes fantasized about just walking away from everything and disappearing to live a quiet, anonymous life where he could be a normal person rather than Elvis Presley, the legend and the icon and the commodity. Priscilla revealed that there had been strange inconsistencies surrounding Elvis's death that had troubled her at the time, but that she had pushed aside because questioning the official story seemed like a form of denial or an inability to accept reality. The funeral had been arranged with unusual haste, she said, and very few people had actually viewed Elvis in the coffin, and those who had seen him reported that something seemed wrong or off about his appearance in ways they could not quite articulate, but that left them feeling unsettled. Vernon Presley had been acting strangely in the weeks before Elvis passed away, making cryptic comments that suggested he knew something was about to happen, but refusing to explain what he meant or why he seemed so worried. She talked about the odd financial transactions that Elvis had made in the final weeks of his life, moving large sums of money around in ways that made no sense if he was expecting to die unexpectedly, but that might make perfect sense if he was planning to disappear and needed to establish secret funds that could support him in a new life under a different identity. Priscilla admitted that over the years since Elvis's death, she had experienced strange incidents that seemed insignificant when viewed individually, but that formed a disturbing pattern when considered together, like unexplained charges on Elvis's credit cards weeks after he passed away, and mysterious phone calls where no one spoke but she could hear breathing on the other end of the line. She revealed that she had kept a private journal where she recorded all these oddities and questions and suspicions, not because she truly believed that Elvis had faked his death, but because she needed to document what she was observing to maintain her own sanity and to have a record of things that seemed wrong or unexplained. The journal had grown thicker over the years as more incidents occurred and as more alleged sightings of Elvis were reported from various locations around the country, And while most of these sightings could be easily dismissed as cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking by grief-stricken fans, a few of them contained specific details that were harder to explain away. But Priscilla's most shocking revelation was still to come, about a message she had received that seemed to come from beyond the grave. The photograph that refused to fade. When the interview finally ended, Priscilla Presley looked worn down but lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her chest. For decades, she had carried questions, doubts, and quiet fears she rarely shared with anyone. Now those thoughts were no longer hers alone. Robert Chen, the journalist who had listened so carefully, walked away with footage that could shake the very foundation of music history and challenge the accepted story of one of the most famous deaths in popular culture. Almost immediately, Robert began building a team. He brought together forensic photographers, digital image experts, handwriting analysts, and investigators skilled in historical records. Their mission was clear but unbelievable: examine the Michigan diner photograph in every possible way and search for evidence that could either confirm or destroy the idea that Elvis Presley had faked his death and lived in secret for years. The photograph became the center of intense scrutiny. Using modern tools that did not exist when the image was taken in 1982, experts studied it pixel by pixel. They searched for signs of editing, manipulation, or darkroom tricks that could suggest a hoax. Nothing appeared out of place. The grain, lighting, and colors matched the look of cheap film cameras common in the early 1980s. Every detail pointed to a real, untouched snapshot taken by an ordinary tourist. Next came facial analysis. Advanced software compared the man in the diner to thousands of verified photos of Elvis from different stages of his life. The results were unsettling. The distance between the eyes, the shape of the jaw, the nose proportions, and especially the ears all showed striking similarities. Experts noted that ears rarely change and are one of the strongest identifiers in facial comparison. While they warned that no software could give total certainty, the odds of this being a random look-alike were described as extremely low. Investigators then tracked down the woman who had taken the photo. Margaret Foster, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio, remembered the trip clearly. She had snapped the picture during a family vacation through Michigan in the summer of 1982. She had no ties to Elvis, no interest in fame, and no reason to lie. When contacted, she was shocked and overwhelmed by the sudden attention. To her, it had always been just another old vacation photo. As the investigation widened, researchers reviewed decades of reported Elvis sightings. Most were quickly dismissed as wishful thinking or obvious hoaxes. Still, a few cases stood out. One involved a man photographed at a gospel concert in Tennessee in 1979. He sat quietly in the back row wearing sunglasses and a hat. Witnesses later claimed he knew every word to rare gospel songs that Elvis deeply loved but few others knew well. The case could not be easily explained away. Money trails added another layer of mystery. Financial investigators examined Elvis's estate records and found strange movements of large sums shortly after his death. Some funds traveled through complex accounts and ended up offshore. These accounts showed repeated withdrawals that looked more like living expenses than estate distributions. The pattern raised troubling questions about whether someone had prepared secret financial support for Elvis under another identity. Even the background of the diner photo raised eyebrows. A rare Stutz Blackhawk appeared behind the man in the image. Records showed the car had been sold shortly after Elvis's death to a buyer hidden behind layers of corporate ownership. Lawyers blocked further inquiries, citing privacy concerns. Once again, the trail went cold, leaving more questions than answers. The secret only two people knew. Weeks later, Priscilla agreed to meet Robert again, this time in a quiet and secure place. She looked tired, but there was also a sense of release in her expression. She explained that she had spent years debating whether to share something she had never told even her closest friends. Now that she had begun, she felt she could not stop halfway. If she was going to speak, she needed to say everything. Priscilla revealed that years before Elvis passed away, during a painful period in their relationship, he had given her a coded phrase. He told her it was a way to reach her secretly if he ever had to disappear. The phrase referred to a private moment from the early days of their love, something only the two of them could possibly know. Then came the moment that changed how her story would be understood. In 1983, 6 years after Elvis's official death, Priscilla received a birthday card with no return address. It was postmarked from a small town in the American Southwest. Inside was only the coded phrase, nothing more. The handwriting looked painfully familiar. She was too afraid to have it analyzed. Terrified of what the answer might reveal, the card left her shaken. If it was real, it meant Elvis was alive and had chosen to stay hidden. If it was fake, it was a cruel and deeply personal trick. Unsure what to do, Priscilla kept the card secret, fearing she might expose him or break her own heart even further. Years later, 2 more messages arrived, each several years apart. Each contained the same phrase written in what appeared to be the same hand. The postmarks came from different small towns across the Southwest, as if the sender never stayed in one place too long. The messages offered no explanations, no locations, and no way to respond. They felt like quiet reminders rather than attempts to reconnect. Carrying this secret took a heavy emotional toll. Priscilla described scanning faces in crowds, airports, and public events, wondering if she might recognize him. She spoke of guilt, especially as her daughter Lisa Marie mourned her father, believing him truly gone. At times, Priscilla questioned her own sanity and tried to accept that Elvis was buried at Graceland, just as the world believed. But the Michigan diner photograph changed something inside her. Combined with the coded messages and the notes she had kept privately for years, it pushed her toward a painful conclusion. She began to believe that Elvis might have staged his death to escape a life that had become unbearable. She recalled how Elvis had spoken in his final months about feeling trapped by fame. He longed to live simply, to walk into a store without being chased or watched. Perhaps disappearing was the only escape he could imagine. Priscilla ended with honesty rather than certainty. She admitted she did not know the truth for sure. The evidence could still be coincidence or misunderstanding, yet she believed people deserved to hear her story. She wanted fans to consider the possibility that the king of rock and roll may have chosen peace over fame, living quietly under another name, far from the spotlight that once defined his life. What do you think about Priscilla Presley's reaction? Do you think there is more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and click the next video shown on your screen.